Good afternoon. Today's topic is Jesus, Joshua, and genocide. Struggling to find a better way and a clearer view. In some ways, with today's video, I'm circling back to the very first video I produced in my video log. And that was on my deconstruction story. In that one, I talked, albeit briefly, about the violence that Yahweh commands and commits in the Old Testament, and the fact that, according to Orthodox Christian doctrine, Jesus is the same being as Yahweh, is one with Yahweh in some mysterious Trinitarian way, but Jesus is God, Jesus is Yahweh, Yahweh is Jesus. Therefore, it seems logical to say that whatever Yahweh does, Jesus also does, or at least bears the equal responsibility for. I don't think it would surprise anyone to say that the violence in the Old Testament has bothered many, many people down through the centuries. I mean, as far as Christians go, you can go all the way back to Marcion, I think in the 2nd or 3rd century. And he saw, in his mind, such a marked difference between Jesus that he had heard about, in the, I assume the Gospels were circulating at that time, so Jesus that he had heard about in the stories and in the Gospels, compared to Yahweh, in the Jewish Bible, the Jewish Old Testament, if you will. It bothered Marcion so much that he started teaching that these are two separate beings, that Jesus is a different God, and he thought we should get rid of the Old Testament altogether and only keep. And honestly, Marcion, in some ways, in some way Christianity owes to Marcion the formation of the canon, because he grouped together the writings that he favored that should be a part of, I guess, the New Covenant, the New Testament, if you will. I don't even know if he called it that, but he grouped writings together. I think this is the first time anyone had done that, and tried to make it authoritative. And part of the reason we have the canon we have now is that Christians who opposed Marcion formed their own in response, if you will, which they included, the Jewish writings that we now call the Old Testament. But he's one of the early examples of someone who was so bothered by the violence that he saw in the older accounts of the actions of Yahweh on behalf of Israel, in judgment against Israel, and those actions in which he commanded Israel to mete out judgment for him against other peoples. I'm going to read one of those accounts today. This is from 1 Samuel. I'm starting in 1 Samuel 14, verse 47. I'm reading the ESV version. And this is an example of what we would today call a genocide, that was commanded by Yahweh, and according to the accounts, was carried out, although not quite to God's satisfaction, as you'll see in a minute. So, I'm starting with verse 47 of chapter 14. This is 1 Samuel. We don't know for sure who the author of 1 Samuel is. Some speculate it might have been Jeremiah, or it might have been Baruch, his secretary, so to speak, his priestly secretary. They might have collaborated together on it. I don't know for sure. There's different arguments out there, different perspectives. Regardless, it's an historical account, of Israel and their dealings with Yahweh and with the nations around them. When Saul had taken the kingship over Israel, all right, I'm going to pause for just a second. when Saul had taken the kingship over Israel, he fought against all his enemies on every side, against Moab, against the Ammonites, against Edom, against the kings of Zobah, and against the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he routed them, and he did valiantly and struck the Amalekites and delivered Israel out of the hands of those who plundered them. There was hard fighting against the Philistines all the days of Saul. And just before this, there was a long account of Saul and his son Jonathan fighting against the Philistines, just for context. So, there was hard fighting against the Philistines all the days of Saul, and when Saul saw any strong man or any valiant man, he attached him to himself. It's like, hey, come fight for me, basically. All right, chapter 15. And Samuel said to Saul, Yahweh sent me to anoint you king over his people Israel. Now therefore, listen to the words of Yahweh. Thus says Yahweh Sabaoth, the Lord of hosts. I have noted what Amalek did to Israel in opposing them on the way when they came up out of Egypt. Now go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. So Saul summoned the people and numbered them in Telaim, 200,000 men on foot and 10,000 men of Judah. And Saul came to the city of Amalek and lay in wait in the valley. Then Saul said to the Kenites, Go, depart, go down from among the Amalekites, lest I destroy you with them. For you showed kindness to all the people of Israel when they came up out of Egypt. So the Kenites departed from among the Amalekites. And Saul defeated the Amalekites from Havilah as far as Shur, which is east of Egypt. And he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and devoted to destruction all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag, and the best of the sheep, and of the oxen, and of the fattened calves, and the lambs, and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. All that was despised and worthless they devoted to destruction. The word of Yahweh came to Samuel. Quote, I regret that I have made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me, and has not performed my commandments. And Samuel was angry, and he cried to Yahweh all night. And Samuel rose early to meet Saul in the morning. And it was told Samuel, Saul came to Carmel, and behold, he set up a monument for himself, and turned and passed on, and went down to Gilgal. And Samuel came to Saul, and Saul said to him, Blessed be you to Yahweh. I have performed the commandment of Yahweh. And Samuel said, What then is this bleating of the sheep in my ears, and the lowing of the oxen that I hear? Saul said, They have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and of the oxen to sacrifice to Yahweh your God, and the rest we have devoted to destruction. Then Samuel said to Saul, Stop, I will tell you what Yahweh said to me this night. And he said to him, Speak. And Samuel said, Though you are little in your own eyes, are you not the head of the tribes of Israel? Yahweh anointed you king over Israel, and Yahweh sent you on a mission and said, Go, devote to destruction the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are consumed. Why then did you not obey the voice of Yahweh? Why did you pounce on the spoil and do what was evil in the sight of Yahweh? And Saul said to Samuel, I have obeyed the voice of the Lord. I have gone on the mission which Yahweh sent me. I have brought Agag, the king of Amalek, and I have devoted the Amalekites to destruction. But the people, they took of the spoil, the sheep and the oxen, the best of the things devoted to destruction, to sacrifice to Yahweh your God in Gilgal. And Samuel said, Has Yahweh as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of Yahweh? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and presumption is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of Yahweh, he has also rejected you from being king. Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned, for I have transgressed the commandment of Yahweh in your words, because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. Now therefore, please pardon my sin and return with me, that I may bow before Yahweh. And Samuel said to Saul, I will not return with you, for you have rejected the word of Yahweh, and Yahweh has rejected you from being king over Israel. As Samuel turned to go away, Saul seized the skirt of his robe, and it tore. And Samuel said to him, Yahweh has torn the kingdom of Israel from you this day, and has given it to a neighbor of yours who is better than you. And the glory of Israel will not lie or have regret, for he is not a man that he should have regret. Then he said, I have sinned, yet honor me now before the elders of my people and before Israel, and return with me, that I may bow before the Lord your God. So Samuel turned back after Saul, and Saul bowed before Yahweh. Then Samuel said, Bring here to me Agag, the king of the Amalekites. And Agag came to him cheerfully. Agag said, Surely the bitterness of death is past. And Samuel said, As your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women. And Samuel hacked Agag to pieces before Yahweh in Gilgal. Then Samuel went to Ramah, and Saul went up to his house in Gibeah of Saul. And Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death. But Samuel grieved over Saul, and Yahweh regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. Intense, right? So just to give you a clue of how passages like this make me personally feel, I read some of it yesterday morning and was just spending some time thinking about it, and I was getting really angry. Pardon me for a second. Sorry about that. I think it's the pollen. I'm out in like a field of flowers. Anyway, I was getting really angry. Let me explain why. So, as you know, over the past year and a half, I've been trying to look at the Bible as if I were an outsider to the Christian faith, as if I were coming to it objectively, if you will, as objectively as anybody can. And in doing that, when I come to passages like these, I kind of take a twofold approach. One, I take the story at face value. You know, it seems clear that the author of this account believes that these events really happened. At least that's the way he seems to be presenting it, that this really happened. That Yahweh literally commanded, he spoke to Samuel, Samuel came to Saul, delivered Yahweh's message. Saul carried it out, although not to Yahweh's satisfaction. He didn't obey every detail of the command. So let's just take it at face value first. So a little bit of historical context. The Amalekites, who are the people in question here, kind of the center point of this account. As the story goes, if you go back to Exodus and you follow the people of Israel after Moses has led them out, God sent the plagues, delivered them from the Egyptians. Moses has led them out. And if I remember the numbers correctly, it listed 600,000 men. That's just the men. Some people have estimated it might have been 2 to 3 million people. If most of those men were married, had wives, kids, grandkids, etc. So you're talking maybe a couple million people, as the story goes, migrating through the Sinai Peninsula. Apparently some people had heard about them ahead of time, as the account goes. So we could assume, although we don't know for sure from the accounts, from what I read, and I read several of the applicable accounts yesterday, none of them are very long, but they mention the interactions with the Amalekites. So if you synthesize the accounts in Deuteronomy, the account in Numbers, and the account in Exodus, as best I can piece together the events, as the Israelites were coming through the Amalekites' territory, or at least close by the Amalekites' territory, the Amalekites apparently came behind and attacked some of the stragglers, this group of 2 million people. I'm assuming maybe some of the older people, maybe some of the women and kids. It doesn't specify whether they killed any of them. I assume probably a few people got killed, at least. It could be that they robbed them. That seems possible, given that when you fast forward to 1 Samuel, which happens roughly 300 years later as the timeline goes, they're robbing from Israel. So one could say, well, maybe that's what they did back then. It's not real clear, but the idea is they attacked Israel. Now, if you go to the account in Numbers, Israel won that victory. There was a fight of some kind that happened. It seems like it only lasted a day, I think. And as the account in Numbers goes, God gave them a miraculous victory. Some of you who are familiar with Bible stories may have heard the one where Moses had to hold his hand up with the staff, and every time, as long as he held his hand up with the staff, Israel would be winning the victory, and if he ever lowered his arm because his arm got tired, they would start losing. So these two guys helped him, hold it up. Anyway, it's that account. So they win against them. So they beat the Amalekites back then. Now, if you look through the accounts of Judges, which at least one scholar I know of, Richard Elliott Friedman, thinks that the account of Judges may have been written by the same person who wrote 1 Samuel. He calls it the Deuteronomist, or the Deuteronomistic history. Anyway, it's beside the point. And I rabbit trailed and lost my train of thought. Oh yes, Judges. So you see over time that the Amalekites had banded together. They had allied with some other groups, some of whom you hear mentioned in this account. And over time, we're talking over, 200-300 years, from time to time, they had fought against Israel. But think about this, just looking at it objectively as you can from a human perspective. You have this group of 2 million people, again, taking the story at face value as an historical account. There's debate about whether all of it actually happened. That's another topic. Taking it at face value as an historical account, you've got 2 million people coming through, and then over the next, over the next 50 to 100 years, they proceed to invade the land of Canaan, and they start wiping people out. They start wiping out entire cities, or going to a city and killing all the men and all the mothers, any woman who had ever had a child or who was past childbearing age, taking the young girls and the teenage girls who were virgins as sex slaves. They're coming in some cases slaughtering all the humans and the animals and burning the city down. They're coming in and conquering this land. So they're invading someone else's land. The Canaanites have been here for a long time. It's mentioned that they were here back when Abraham and his people were passing through, before Israel's even a nation. And they're still there 400 years later, as the story goes, after the Jews had already been enslaved. So they've been there a long time. That's their home, right? The Israelites, they're the invaders. They're the encroachers. Again, looking at this from a human perspective. They're invading other people's land, trying to conquer it, take their stuff, or destroy their stuff and their people. And from time to time you have groups like the Amalekites or the Moabites or the Kenites, who, maybe not the Kenites, I think the Kenites made a deal with them, if memory serves me, but you had groups that would stand up against them and fight against them, would attack them, like the Philistines, for instance. Because, again, these people, they're colonialists, essentially. Again, looking at this objectively, taking the historical account at face value, the details of it, but looking at it from a human perspective, looking at it from the perspective of the people who fought against Israel, they had done nothing to Israel. These people had been in Egypt for 400 years, so the Amalekites, the Moabites, Edomites, what have you, they hadn't done squat to this people group who's coming up out of Egypt. There's 2 million people. The people in the land of Canaan had done nothing to them. They had done nothing to harm them. They were not their enemies. And then they come in and start slaughtering them. So, needless to say, that would have provoked a lot of fear, that would have provoked a lot of anger, a desire for retribution, a desire for revenge, because these are normal humans, desire to just protect their family and their property, That's just normal, right? Now the Amalekites, you could say, well, in the account 300 years ago, it does seem like they might have, and it's only one verse in Deuteronomy 25 that says this. So, historically speaking, that's sketchy. You've got one very brief reference to it. So I don't know. You would need outside corroboration for it to be considered historically viable. But there is a verse in Deuteronomy 25. I think it's 17 through 19. Just 2-3 verses there. Very brief passage that mentions that they attacked the stragglers. It doesn't specify who the stragglers were, whether they were old, young, sick, but one could assume. So that's pretty low. Like that's messed up, right? So it seems like, reading this passage, that then the justification that Yahweh gives, or the reason Yahweh gives, he says, I have noted what Amalek did to Israel in opposing them on the way when they came out of Egypt. That's the reason he gives. He doesn't say anything about them opposing them in the interim. He doesn't say anything about the recent robberies that have been happening, or, plundering, what have you. He mentions that one instance that happened 300 years ago. So everybody living in Amalek now are just, they're descendants of those people, but that's their ancestors. Those ancestors have been dead for a long time. Many of them were probably killed by the Israelites. So God now, he doesn't fully explain why, but he says, but except for that reason, he says, because they did this, and it's like 300 plus years ago, I want you now to go and wipe them out. Not just the men, not just the soldiers, everybody. The soldiers and the rest of the men, old and young, I don't care. All the women and all the children, including the infants. And not only that, but all of their animals. All of their animals. And then, as the story goes, Yahweh gets angry, so angry that he literally removes Saul from his kingship because he didn't kill all the animals. He killed some of them, like the weak ones, the ugly ones, maybe the sick ones, some that had deformities, but they kept the good ones, ostensibly, Saul says, for sacrifices. I don't know whether that was true or not. Cattle and things were a sign of wealth, so it might have just been his booty. Hard to say. Regardless, Yahweh got so angry that he didn't kill all the animals, that he didn't kill Saul, but he removed him from his position as king and put David in later. So just the juxtaposition here. Again, Yahweh is Jesus, Jesus is Yahweh. They are one and the same. They are the same being, yet distinct somehow. The Trinity, right? But they're God. They're both God. So they're both responsible for this action. So the same God who told Saul to devote to destruction, or to use a stronger word, annihilate an entire people group down to the last baby, and this probably included pregnant women, because if you got, I don't know how many people lived in Amalek, but the amount of territory he mentions there is quite large, so I'm guessing at least 50 to 100,000 maybe. I don't know for sure, but let's just say, for sake of speculation, it's 100,000 people living in this broad territory of Amalek. Let's say, given relatively normal ratios, that at least half of those are adults. So let's say potentially there's like 50,000 kids. So by Jewish standards, that would be anybody under the age of 12, right? 12, 13. So let's say there might have been 40 to 50,000 kids. Let's just say 40,000 for the sake of argument. 40,000 kids. And God wants Saul to take his army down and kill every last one of them with the sword. How is that just? And my Christian instincts automatically kick in and was like, well, it's God. God can do what God wants, right? We all belong to God. God owns us. God is just. Whatever God does is good. Therefore, he must have had good reason. But, he essentially tells you what the reason is. There's a hint at another reason, when Samuel, although it seems to be directed more specifically at Agag, he says, as your sword, Samuel's saying to Agag, as your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women. So that may indicate that Agag had perhaps had done something similar to what Saul just did, commanded his armies to go in and kill children. Maybe he had done so to the Israelites at different times in the different wars they had over the years. So this is basically, in a sense, this is a form of reciprocity, negative reciprocity, if you will. Like, hey, you came in and killed our kids, so we went and killed your kids, and now I'm going to kill you too. And he literally, slices the dude to pieces with a sword right there. And it seems, he says he did it before Yahweh, so the impression you get is that this is with Yahweh's approval, which makes sense because Yahweh had told Saul to kill everybody, and I think that included King Agag. I don't really know why Saul preserved Agag and not anybody else. I don't know. It's a good question. If there's nobody left, it's not like you could hold him for ransom. Who knows? Who knows what his reason was? Maybe he's like, hey, you're a fellow king. I'm going to show you a little bit of respect and not kill you. I'm just going to kill everybody else. So again, looking at this from a human level, I can't see how this is different from the idea of jihad. This hey, our God commands us to go and kill all the infidels. How is it? I don't see how it's much different than that. Just qualitatively, how it's any different than that. I don't know. So that obviously causes me to struggle with Jesus, because my Christian upbringing says